Drowning from inside out, a rare complication that makes for a harrowing day, by Phil Walker. This is my story. On Monday, June 21st, 2010, I nearly drowned on the back deck of a dive boat 42 kilometers off Moorhead City, North Carolina. The day started with a 5:30 a.m. wake-up from an all-too-short night. My teenage son and I had arrived at Moorhead City the previous evening after a late getaway from Richmond. This was his first offshore trip. The ride out to the dive site was a little choppy but uneventful. Any day the sea cooperates is probably a pretty good day for diving off the North Carolina coast. The water was warmish at about 22 degrees centigrade at the bottom, and visibility was about 20 meters. We were exploring a wreck of the U-352, a German submarine that was depth-charged by a US Coast Guard cutter during World War II, and now lies around 30 meters. Exactly 1 year prior to this dive, I had saved a diver who'd run out of air on this very wreck. It was just before midday when we began to ascend from our second dive. At 15 meters, I coughed for the first time. It was a normal, tickle sort of cough from dry air, except, unusually, there was a gurgle of liquid deep in my throat. By 10 meters, I was coughing continuously, and with each cough, more liquid rose in my throat. It tasted metallic, not quite like blood, but not quite like saliva either. When we transferred to the safety line around 6 meters, I began to breathe quickly. I was now actively swallowing fluids and coughing up, and the urge to rip my regulator out of my mouth was almost overwhelming. Despite efforts to calm down and slow my breathing, I sucked on my regulator desperately, taking increasingly rapid, shallow breaths. I had no doubt that I was over-breathing the regulator, but I couldn't understand why. Bad air? Probably not. I had dived with gas from the same source in the morning. Pulmonary embolism? Doubtful. I had not made any rapid ascents, and I was well within my no decompression limits. It quickly became clear that I'd either have to surface or run the risk of passing out. So I grabbed my son to buddy up with him and someone else. I put his hand on the other divers and looked into his eyes and headed up. Leaving was almost as difficult as breathing. Reaching the stern of the boat about half a minute later, I signaled distress and was promptly hauled bodily out of the water by the crew. To be perfectly honest, I expected to cough up whatever was in my throat, and I thought I might be fine by the time I reached the boat. I was wrong, and it was most disappointing and terrifying to experience this. As I was hauled onto the swim step of the diver down, I gasped for air, croaking, "I can't breathe, can't breathe." Behind me, my son emerged from the water, safe but shocked as the crew raced to prepare oxygen and to move me inboard. My skin was pale, my lips and fingernails were blue, and with each failed breath, it became clearer to me that this was where I was going to die, cold and wet on the back of a dive boat. Not what I had expected. Just then, fortune intervened. My friend Sharky, an emergency medical technologist with diving medicine training, was already back on board. He took my vitals and placed oxygen over my face. He listened to my lungs and could hear the crackle of liquid as I struggled to breathe. He relayed the grim news to the captain, that they needed to get me on shore as quickly as possible. Now stripped from my insulating wetsuit, I began to get really cold. I remember having increasing difficulty staying awake. I was starting to detach and accept death. At least I was, until I looked up and saw my son. I couldn't possibly die there in front of him, so I renewed my struggle for air. Sharky was also in my field of vision, staring right into my eyes, imploring me to breathe. Another friend wrapped his body around mine to keep me warm, whispering, "You're safe now. We've got you, brother. Stay with me." The divers and the crew all found ways to help. A few joined Sharky in debating possible diagnoses. Had I inhaled water? No. Had I come up too fast? No, at least not according to my computer. Did I have pulmonary decompression illness? Chokes? Didn't seem likely. Meanwhile, I was barely holding my own on the back deck, now awash with diving equipment and very worried divers. With all the divers safely back on board, and no help available from the Coast Guard, the decision was made to race me in. One of the great things about the dive vessel we were on was its speed. It can do 21 knots, or about 50 kilometers per hour, making it perfect at reaching rarely dived wrecks offshore, and in this case, serving as my ambulance. My buddies took turns in trying to keep me warm, all the while making entirely inappropriate jokes about splitting up my dive gear, taking my money, and so on. It was hard to breathe, and it was also hard not to laugh. As we got underway, my son took his turn, sticking with me and keeping me present. Throughout the 90-minute trip, he kneeled beside me and supported my back. The swell from the bow sprayed over us as the vessel hammered through the waves. Each time my son would hunch over me protectively. The crew took turns taking my vitals and making sure I was awake and breathing. 10 minutes after making landfall, we were in the emergency department at Carteret General Hospital. From there I was transferred to critical care as they worked to keep my oxygen levels up. 24 hours and a lot of oxygen later, I walked out under my own steam, to the applause of the unit's nursing staff. Apparently such dramatic recoveries after such serious symptoms weren't common. Thanks to the quick actions of the crew, my son, my friends, and the experts at Divers Alert Network, I had survived. It was a really good day after all. The obvious question I had, though, is, what happened? To put it simply, I drowned from the inside out. The Dan medical team pegged my condition as immersion pulmonary edema, also called swimming-induced pulmonary edema. Immersion pulmonary edema, or IPE, is an accumulation of fluid in the lungs while in the water. Unlike drowning, IPE does not involve breathing in water. Instead, a spike in blood pressure in the blood vessels of the lung causes blood and blood fluids to leak into the spaces of the air sacs in the lungs. The reason for the spike, particularly in individuals who are otherwise healthy, is not entirely clear. Research at Duke Center for Hyperbaric Medicine and Environmental Physiology, under the leadership of Dr. Richard Moon, is helping to improve our understanding of the phenomenon. After extensive testing, the assessment was that I was simply unfortunate, part of the 1% of divers who are prone to this condition. To return to diving, I've been advised to lose some weight, lower my blood pressure, get recertified with my dry suit, and start diving dry for anything colder than tropical dives. The doctor also recommended I avoid excessive hydration before diving and consider taking some antihypertensive medicine. Always note that a diving physician should be involved in these management decisions. So after careful consideration, I made the decision to retire from offshore wreck diving, decompression diving, and diving deeper than 30 meters. The logic is simple. It appears that despite my best efforts, I might experience this again. And if it occurs at depth, I will use up my air in a heartbeat. I am fortunate to have a wonderful family whom I love and who need me. I also have an incredible dive family who would do everything within their power and did do so to save me. I cannot responsibly ask either my family or diving family to bear this risk. So instead, I'll enjoy the wonders, colors, and warmth near the surface, and look for other ways to engage my passion for the depths. Every incident has its causes. The bottom line was a gap in my fitness level combined with unfortunate genetics that seemed to have increased my risk. Like many of us, I've picked up some pounds over the years, and this has raised my blood pressure slightly. It wasn't a big deal on land, but it did become one underwater. I was already a huge fan of Divers Alert Network, but this cemented it for me. Dan's awareness campaigns ensured that there was a lot of oxygen on board and crew that were trained to administer it. Research done by Dan informed the dive medical treatment. Dan Funds supported the research I participated in, and Dan Coverage paid for all my out-of-pocket expenses with the care I needed. It's hard to imagine that Dan could have done anything else or more. So here's my takeaway. I have a resting pulse in the 40s, and I can ride, run, and swim for hours at a stretch. In many ways, I'm a pretty fit guy. But diving takes me into an environment that is inherently hazardous. Any weakness in my constitution, when combined with circumstances and genetics, can generate many different ways to succumb. While advances in equipment and training have made diving safer than ever, I need to keep my Dan membership and diving coverage up to date, and to take my A game to the water every time. I recommend that you do the same.